Hey guys, Mr. McGrain here, and today we're going to do a quick introduction to opinion polling and what opinion polling is and some different types of it, and why it's important to be able to study and analyze. So the first thing, just to kind of get you in the right mindset here, is to think about this policymaking system and think about how the policymaking system starts with people and ends with people. And so in a democratic system, it's really important to understand how people and their beliefs and their ideas are what drive the policymaking process and the policy agenda. And so we have to start thinking about, like, what do people believe, right? Most Americans right now support granting legal immigrant status to people who were brought illegally when they were children. Most people think that, right, that the government has a high responsibility to protect our air and water and provide K-12 education. Far fewer think it's the government's job to provide a college education, right? People think about military and foreign policy and what President Biden was doing in Afghanistan in terms of withdrawing U.S. troops. And so the big question is, these opinions are really critical to driving the policies and the beliefs of politicians and how they're going to act. But we also have to understand where these numbers come from. How do we know how strongly people believe in these things? And the biggest answer to that, of course, is simply the answer of polling. And any type of poll that's used for political purposes, in a sense, is sometimes called an opinion poll. And an opinion poll is just going to try and gather what people believe about a certain issue. There are a couple different types of polls, though, that you should know by name and know what distinguishes one type of poll from another. For example, there are polls that are called benchmark polls. Benchmark polls are sometimes called baseline polls as well. A politician might run a benchmark poll when they announce or in the process of announcing that they want to run for office, to see how many people support them, and then to figure out, whether certain decisions change their support over time. A politician might also run a benchmark poll to see if a certain policy decision is popular or is changing someone's opinion. So how many people supported this issue at a given point, and then we enact a policy and we want to see if that policy changes the amount of support that a given issue has. Similar to benchmark polls are called tracking polls. Tracking polls survey the same people repeatedly over a period of weeks or months to try and get a glimpse of how individuals are changing their mind. These polls are still anonymous. They're not going to report what an individual believes, but instead of a group of 100 people today and then a different group of 100 people next week, if we ask the same 100 people the same questions, we can figure out whether an individual is really being swayed by the news or by the media or by the way a policy is being enacted. There are also polls called entry and exit polls. These are polls that survey voters. Entry polls survey voters on the way into a polling place where you vote. Exit polls survey people on the way out, and they simply ask the basic question, how did you vote on question X, or how did you vote on issue Y? If you've ever watched presidential returns come in and they talk about their exit polls show that Donald Trump did really well in this neighborhood, or that Joe Biden did really well in this area. They're talking about exit polls most of the time, where they're saying we're getting a hint that in this corner of a certain state, people were going this direction, and if that holds true across the whole state, then how is that going to change an election? The last type of poll, just in general, that you should know is called a focus group. And a focus group is not the same as a broad opinion poll, but it is a very small group of people. You can see in this picture 15 or 20 people who are brought together to have a more in-depth conversation. And rather than being an anonymous poll, it uses a show of hands, then it asks people to elaborate on their opinion or why they think that. These polls can be really good for helping to dig into why people are thinking a certain way, because you can ask a follow-up question and you can get what is going on in their brain and what might change their mind. But they, of course, are going to be a little bit less representative of the entire population because they are so small in terms of the number of people. So 4 different kind of styles of polling there that you should know as a starting point for what polls are in the first place and what they do. But the second thing we need to also be able to do with a poll is we need to be able to analyze how trustworthy a poll really is. We need to be able to evaluate a poll and evaluate the data that a poll is giving us. And so there are a couple of things you should look at in a poll as you're doing this to ensure that you are getting a complete image of what that poll is telling you and how accurately that poll is telling you something. So the first thing you should always look at when you look at a poll is you should look at how many people the poll talked to. This is also called the sample size, or how big the poll was, because the sample size is going to affect what we call the margin of error. The more people you talk to, the closer you get to having an accurate result. And in statistics, you actually don't need to talk to an enormous number of people to get your margin of error pretty small. Even in a large country like the United States with 330 million people, if you talk to 1,000 people, you're going to get pretty close to an accurate level of opinion, right? But the basic rule here is that the larger the sample is, the more accurate the poll will be, and the smaller the margin of error is likely to be. And if you think back, that's why, in particular, a focus group can be really good for certain strategies, but it can be less accurate in terms of giving you the true picture of the entire country or a state or a county, because it's just not enough people to get you close. Another thing you want to look at is who the poll sampled. Who did they actually talk to over the course of their polling? Right? Samples can be random, which means they can just call anybody. Or some pollsters try to make their samples representative. So they might try to ensure that they get equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans if the numbers of Democrats and Republicans in the country are equal. Or they might try and make sure that they get the right percentage of African Americans versus the right percentage of Hispanics versus the right percentage of white Americans, the right percentage of male and female to represent the population appropriately, right? So, who are they actually talking to? A really important one in a lot of election polls is, are you talking to everybody? Are you talking to people who can actually vote? Or are you talking to people who are actually very likely to vote, people who vote regularly? Because what the general population believes might be different from what people who are actually going to show up at the polls, the election polls, do. So make sure you look at who the poll talked to give you a little bit of a window into whether this poll is really representative of the entire population or just representative of a specific subgroup. The third piece you want to look at is how the poll collected its data. Traditional polls were almost all done by phone, but in a modern era of call screening and caller ID, so many people don't answer their phones that a lot of pollsters have moved towards online polling. And there is sometimes a belief about where people will be more honest or where people will maybe put more of their energy. Will somebody answer an online poll just by clicking through the buttons as fast as they can to get it done? Or will people answer an online poll more honestly because they think it's more anonymous? Sometimes on phone, the phone can be a live interviewer who asks you the questions and records your response, or it can be a push button poll where you push 1 for yes and 2 for no. And again, there's sometimes a belief that a different type of poll might get a different type of result from the individual you're talking to. And the last thing you want to look at, of course, is what were the questions that were actually asked in the poll, and how are those questions phrased, or how are they posed? The way in which you phrase your question can sometimes impact the way that people respond. And of course, the questions you ask and even the order in which you ask your questions can lead people to be more likely to give one answer or another. As a great example of this, there is a certain type of poll that's not actually a poll at all. It's called a push poll. And a push poll is used by political campaigns sometimes to change opinion. They're not actually trying to gather opinion, they're trying to influence your opinion. And so, for example, this push poll question, should Nancy Pelosi be indicted and jailed for her crimes? If you notice, that poll or that question implies that there were crimes committed. And so more than caring about your answer to a yes or a no, this question is actually trying to make you associate Nancy Pelosi with doing something illegal. And it's not really interested in whether you say yes or no. It's interested in putting that in your brain so that maybe the next time somebody asks you a question, or when you go to vote, or when you go to think about whether you support a given policy, that you will respond with this in the back of your mind. So those are the basics that you need to know. I am going to go really quickly after this slide, go into a specific poll, just so you can see how we work through it a little bit, but not necessary to stick around if you don't want to for the remainder of the video here. So this is a poll that is conducted by the company Ipsos, who is a poller. It was done just a week or so ago, and it was a general poll trying to get opinion on lots of different issues, right? But notice that the poll has released all kinds of data for you to be able to analyze. It gives you your sample size. They surveyed just over 1,000 Americans. It tells you that they were all over 18. This is an indicator that this is a general population poll. It was not necessarily registered voters or likely voters. And it also tells us that this was an online survey. It also breaks down how these people affiliated: 424 Democrats, 386 Republicans, and 112 independents. And then it says that they couldn't necessarily get it to be representative, so they weighted the results. They changed the results to kind of make sure that they were more representative of all different ideas. Right? So because of this, the poll has a 3.5% confidence interval for everyone. But because the individual groups here are smaller numbers, the margin of error on these groups get larger as you have fewer people, right? With only 100 independents being surveyed, we have a 10.6% margin of error that is associated with what they think in terms of how this poll is reported. Right? And so then what we can do is we can take this and we can look at one of the questions in this poll. Here we can see the question. Overall, do you approve or disapprove of the way Joe Biden is handling his job as president? And we can see that in the current poll, the final result was 47% approve to 46% disapprove. So a really tight number there. You can see over time it has been wider at different points. But if we jump back, we can see that that 47% is within that margin of error, right? This +1, more people approving than disapproving, is so narrow that it's within the margin of error for our adults. So really we can say that we're not totally sure whether most people approve of President Biden or not, because the poll is so tight and the margin of error is larger than the margin in the poll itself. This question, by the way, hopefully you would agree with me, is a very fair way of asking a question, providing two options with no wording that kind of sways people back and forth. So in class, you guys will work with your teacher to break down polls and to evaluate how credible a poll is and how much information you can pull out of it. Hope this was helpful, and I'll see you guys in class this week.